Everyone. Thank you so much for the gift of your time and attention. I'm immensely grateful to Dr. Ketahakis for this opportunity and to be able to spend time with you all. Um, we'll go ahead and jump right in. I am, as introduced, I'm Darrin Ford. Uh, at Mindfulness Academy for Addiction and Trauma Training, we help train therapists and certify them in the modality of a mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapy. As said before, I own or have started Mindful Centers, which has offices in Newport Beach, Long Beach, and West Los Angeles. Also TMAT, which is the Mindfulness Academy for Addiction and Trauma Training, where we help certify therapists. And then also Sono Press. Sono Press is a company that I have founded to help therapists develop their own book from concept to shelf. We can walk you all the way through. So we're just going to kind of dive right in. Our objectives today are first going to be to look at what is the mind and mindfulness. We hear people talk about mindfulness all the time, but we don't really think about what is the mind. So that's the first thing we're going to define. Then we're going to look at how the role of neuroplasticity is incorporated in mindfulness, how it affects mindfulness, and how mindfulness can affect the brain. We'll also explore the role of mindfulness and neuroplasticity in treating addictive disorders specifically. And then the last part we'll talk about is how to identify self-intimacy, which is vital to our recovery process. So, when talking about mindfulness, we have to talk about the mind. When we talk about addiction, we really have to talk about how to develop self-intimacy, because that's the keystone to recovery. So what is the mind? Well, I love to start with this slide, which is that by the time we have taken in the data from our environment and organized it and coordinated it in our brain and created a thought construct in relationship to it, we're already 80 milliseconds in the past. So the moment that you think you're in the present, you're already in the past by 80 milliseconds. And this is a very important concept when we start to talk about mind, because what I'm attempting to help us all see here is that what we think is so certain to be real is actually not so real, if you will. So as I said, therefore, whenever we think we're in the present, we're actually already in the past. So the present is actually unknown. It's an uncertain plane of possibility, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And whenever we believe these constructs of certainty, that's when we can get ourselves into trouble. So at TMAT, we look at the mind, and in mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapy, we define the mind as a sense organ. So, you have your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, your skin, and then you have the mind. The mind takes in all of the data from all the other sense organs, organizes it and coordinates it, reflects on our past, and spits out a hypothesis about our future. That hypothesis is never 100% correct. We can get close, but we're never 100% correct. And we can illustrate this through, drawing optical illusions, all of these different ways of kind of tricking our mind, right? And so the mind does the best it can with the sensory organs that it has, but it's never 100% correct. And so there's quick ways that we can look at and illustrate this through cognitive neurobiology. And so I want to just play a very quick film here that will be reviewed, but it also illustrates this process. So here we go.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Interactive Biology TV, where we're making biology fun. My name is Leslie Samuel, and in this episode 29, I'm going to be giving a general overview of how senses work. So let's get right into it. Now, we all know about the five senses. We have the sense of taste, smell, touch, hearing, and sight. And I'm going to get into some more details specifically with hearing and sight in future episodes. But for today, I just want to give a framework on which we're going to base what we're going to be talking about in the future episodes. So, this is how senses work. We're going to start with receptors, and these receptors are going to get stimulated. When they're stimulated, they're going to send signals to the brain. And when the brain receives those signals, the brain is going to interpret the signals, and it's basically going to tell you what the senses are. So if you smell a perfume, it's because the receptors are stimulated, sending signals to the brain, and the brain interprets that as a beautiful scent or an aromatic scent, or however you want to call that. So once again, the receptors get stimulated, signals get sent to the brain, and then the brain interprets those signals. Let's look specifically at how this happens in the eye. In the eye, we have the retina. And in the retina, we have receptors that we call rods and cones. And you can see these receptors right here. Now, when those receptors get stimulated, they're going to cause a signal that goes via a number of different types of cells, and then it goes via a nerve to the brain. Then the brain is going to interpret that, and you're going to see the person that's standing in front of you, or whatever it is you're looking at. You're going to see that as a result of receptors getting stimulated over here. And then you have a nerve that sends a signal to the brain, and then the brain interprets that signal. This is the same process for touch. This is the same process for smell and the other senses. The receptors get stimulated, and then that sends a signal to the brain, and the brain interprets that signal. That's really all I want to talk about in this video. It's not a lot of detail, but trust me, we're going to start filling in those details in later episodes, and we're going to talk specifically about.
So this is just a quick kind of review, but to start to get us to move into the conceptualization process here and help us start to externally develop some imagery to help us reference this process.
Hello.
So when we talk about mind and brain, it's important to distinguish between the two, the difference between the two. So to think of the brain as physical wetware, right? That it's very much like a processor in a computer in many ways, right? That wetware takes in data, and it's a conglomerate of neural pathways that are interconnected that create patterns and processes that develop memories based off of cues. The mind is actually the mental activity related to that biological activity. So it's similar to a video screen on a computer or the software of the computer. It's what takes the electrical impulses in and then references those memories and spits out the best image or best assumption that it can related to the stimuli. And this is one of the most important aspects of the mind when we start to talk about addiction and recovery. And that is the idea of focus. And focus of the mind can create neural pathways in the brain. So we often hear how biology can affect the construct of mental processes or the mind. But where we have not developed enough awareness of until recently is how the focus of the mind can develop neural pathways within the brain that we, to some extent, can actually, with the focus of our mind, create new neural constructs harness the use of neuroplasticity to move the conceptualizations that our mind creates into a direction that would be better suited for a healthier, I'll put that in air quotes, healthier way of living. And this is really important because focus can be an incredibly powerful tool. So the mind, it does this process, and as it does this, each decision that is made, right, is the mind moving us from the infinite plane of possibility, or where reality is, into more certainty. And I have another slide that will explain this more concretely. And this is in reference to Daniel Siegel's Infinite Plane of Possibility in The Mindful Therapist. And an incredibly wonderful book. And so the idea of sexuality, this is, an illustration of this. The idea of sexuality in youth is an open plane of possibility, right? And there's all of these possible things that can be arousing and sexualizing and stimulating sexually to the human organism, to human beings. And as we move through our upbringing, what happens in the environment correlated with biology, right, will start to develop the arousal template for us. And we'll start to create our sexualized aspects. Now, the mind and the biology could not agree at times, right? And then that creates conflict in the individual, right? So the mind is shaped by the external upbringing or the environment, right? But the biology may not match what the mind has been programmed with, and this creates a conflict within somebody, right? And so we should really do our best here in life, right, to see the mind rather than identifying with it as absolute truth. When we identify with our mind, instead of just allowing our mind to go through awareness, when we grab onto it and say, oh, this is absolute truth, this is when we suffer. And I'll talk more about this later. So, and this leads to the slide, which is we can't always trust our mind's projections. One's thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and all constructs are designed for survival, not truth. And, this has been illustrated time and time again in what we would call is game theory. So Daniel Hoffman, in his book, The Argument Against Reality, talks about how they've taken and developed in virtual realities virtual organisms, and they've given them virtual minds. And they develop one virtual organism with a virtual conceptualizational mind that relates to its environment by telling that organism the absolute truth about its environment. And then they develop another virtual reality where they had an organism in there where they programmed the mind to lie to the organism, but tell it whatever lie it needed to know just to survive. And 100% of the time in all of the tests, the one organisms whose mind told them the absolute truth about the environment, they were unsuccessful in surviving. It was only the organism that whose minds lied to them that survived, or told them whatever they needed to know to survive that environment. And so, so this is, again, some external, if you will, data that shows us that this idea of our mind not being us, but us being separate from the mind, is actually real, and that our mind can't always, I should rephrase this, that the first hypothesis our mind puts out can't always be trusted, right? So what we do is we step back in mindfulness, and as these ideas flow past our awareness, we look at those and we can evaluate them if we're in our prefrontal cortex enough and say, no, that one's not going to work for me. Let's let that one pass. Oh, this one, that one will work. That one will is how I want to match to my reality, or that one seems more accurate to me. And then we can move into that one. Okay. So some of the antidotes of the suffering, right, is to be present with uncertainty. Mind is the perceiver of reality. It is not reality itself. Another example of this is a butterfly. So we have, I think, 7 rods and cones in our eyes, and that allows us to see the rainbow. However, a butterfly has well over 200 rods and cones. And so they see hundreds of different colors that we would never hope to see, right? And who's to say that the butterfly's interpretation of reality is somehow broken and ours is absolutely correct? The truth is that the mind takes in the data and does the best it can, right, based off of the sense organs. You ever wonder why it's so hard to hit a fly? It's very hard to hit a fly if you're going to swat a fly, because a fly processes data so much faster, which means when we're swinging our hand incredibly fast to the fly, it's going very slow. And so the fly can just easily move out of the way. It perceives, right, and interprets time differently than we do, right? Our motion, I should say, differently than we do. So if we are not over-identified with the mind, then we can see our thoughts more clearly. By seeing our thoughts more clearly, we can make more skillful choices related to reality. In turn, this ability will reduce the reactionary nature of our choices, right? And this is incredibly important, because what we know, right, is that reactionary behaviors for addiction especially, right, are not a good plan, right? Because usually addiction is based out of impulsive reaction. Oh, let's do this, it will feel good and take me away from what feels bad. And I put that in kind of air quotes, right? I should say too, I'd like to take a moment to preface that, when I talk, when I present things, I want you to know that I present it from a neutral standpoint. I do my best not to align with good, bad, right, wrong. I do my best to take those ideas and move them aside, because it's more about acceptance of what is happening, right? So that we can then work with that reality versus labeling it as right, wrong, good, bad. So reactivity can be described as behavior or thoughts which lack mindfulness. Reactivity is the driver and sustainer of mind states. And a mind state, this is, I didn't really go into this in this presentation, but since I referenced it here, I think I need to take a moment to talk about a mind state. And mind states are basically, they're the lens that coats the projection of our mind. So let me explain more carefully. If we are taught growing up that anger, like I was, I'll give you an example for me, right? I grew up in a very violent home. When I lived with my biological father, he was an alcoholic and a sex addict, and there was a lot of abuse. And that abuse created a lens for which I saw and related to the emotion of anger through. And I associated anger with rage. And so anytime I started to feel anger, my mind would react by pushing it down or have an aversive relationship to it. It would create an aversive mind state. I would push that away, because the story that my mind projected was, to have anger means that you're going to be a rageful, mean person, right? And so I would repress that. And so what happened? I became less and less tolerant of the emotion of anger. And then it came out covertly, and I didn't notice it until later. One time, and I shared this in my in a chapter in my book, in Awakening, I was talking to my team when I worked for a heroin addiction treatment program in San Antonio, and they were sitting at their chairs and they were all kind of going like this, and I was shocked to see their behaviors. And so I asked them, what's going on? Why are you guys all leaning back in your chair? And they were quiet. And I said, listen, I really want to understand this. And so one of them spoke up and said, you seem a little angry. And I was just washed over with shame because I had no mindful awareness that that's the way my behaviors were being projected. And that's because my mind had pushed anger so far away from my awareness that I had no ability to recognize it. And so I had to really sit down and apologize and, tell them kind of a little bit of my story and right. And then move into that discomfort and be compassionate towards myself. And this is really the gifts of mindfulness. And we'll talk more about this. So, right. So a defense of the mind is to maintain a certain mind state. And that's kind of what I was sharing, right? That aversive mind state. I often tell people the mind does what it knows, not what it needs. All of our minds want to stay in familiarity, right? We can think about the pandemic, right? When the pandemic hit and we all had to move into isolation, right? And it was very difficult because the mind wasn't used to isolation. After a year or so, right, of living our lives like this, our mind somewhat became more accustomed to it. And now what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a lot of individuals who are struggling with social anxiety as they go back out into society. And that's because the mind, it's a creature of habit. It likes to do what it knows, what it gets used to, because it thinks that's what's safe. That's what we need to survive. And yet, if our mind is still relating to the world, like, for example, with me, as if it is in a hostile, angry environment, then it will, right, project out into the world that kind of behavior, and that will be mismatched from what the reality is that we're actually living in, because we've changed, right? So, but we'll get more into that. Sorry, I digress. So, so an example of this defensive nature, right, can be when an addict is caught in the act and they react with aggression towards their partner, right? They gaslight their partner. They tell their partner that what their partner's seeing isn't real, right? And that's because that's the addict's mind's way of defending itself against the shame and the guilt and all of the other individual emotions that they struggle with, which is why they became addicts mainly to begin with. And that's when we talk about, now we get more specific. So instead of talking about the mind, we're going to start to talk about characteristics of the addicted mind. And the addicted mind is tyrannical and fixated. It is hyper-focused on creating detachment from the uncertainty of intimacy. Do you remember that plane of possibility, right? When we're moving to self-intimacy, we're moving into uncertainty, right? Into an area that the mind's not familiar with. And a byproduct of that is that we feel the emotions, and those are uncomfortable because we're moving closer to the uncertainty. And so as a side effect, the mind becomes hyper-focused on finding ways and means to distract us, right? It maintains the focus of distraction, if you will, habitualizing the addictive behavior to such an extent that everything else is left undone and chaos ensues. And right now I'm a consulting supervisor for some people who are getting their certification as mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapists, and we just had them do a exercise with addictive substances where they invited themselves to abstain from any one substance or any one behavior for a week. It could be anything from caffeine to social media, just to get an experiential awareness of what it's like to have to deal with moving away from the familiarity or the habitualized mind state. And it's very shocking for a lot of people who haven't struggled with addiction to do this, because they realize just how difficult that can be and how tyrannical the mind can be. I often tell clients and other clinicians that I work with, be wary of the tyranny of the fixated mind, because once that mind is fixated on something and we've identified with that, nothing else is possible. And that can be a very dangerous place. And this chaos that ensues from this tyrannical fixation, right, creates a need for ever more intense experiences to distract an ever increasing nature of uncertainty. The more chaos, right, the more nervousness, the more unknowns, and therefore the greater levels of intensity have to be created in order to move us away. And this is, when we're talking about sex addiction, right, this is one of the signs of progression. Or even porn addiction, right, going into ever more taboo, intense subject matters in pornography or in physical behaviors. So if we're working as a mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapist, our goal, if there is, a particular goal, is to help the client recognize that they are not their own minds, right? And to gain distress tolerance of or in the uncertainty. And they do this by allowing themselves to just be present in the awareness of the discomfort, and then creating physical activities like breathing, running, all of these different mindful activities to utilize constructive compassion and care for themselves, right, in a more constructive way versus a destructive way versus the destructive way that they were caring for themselves in the past. And we want to do this by having an acute awareness that each moment is transitory, right? And you can see this word equanimous, right, or equanimous, and depending on how you want to enunciate it. And really what it means is balanced. If we look at everything in nature, we see that everything, all systems attempt to create a homeostasis or a balance or an equanimic relationship. Everything biologically in our body is working towards maintaining balance. The brain does the same thing. That's why it creates more receptors in reaction to addictive substances, right? And that's why we gain biological tolerance. And it's the same way in relationship to the mind and how it relates to reality. And so if we maintain an equanimous relationship to each moment, and that means a relationship that is based in awareness and non-reactivity. It doesn't mean we don't feel discomfort. It doesn't mean that we don't experience discomfort. It's that we've exercised that distress tolerance muscle enough that we're able to just be present with that and see that for what it is, a normal state of being human that is transitory and not permanent. And if we're able to do that, we have a greater propensity to manifest choices that are more skillfully related to a life in recovery. And that is the crux. Incredibly difficult to do. Make no mistake about it. I never promise any clients that this process is easy. However, it's worth learning how to do. Let's be honest, being an active in addiction isn't easy. So to have an equanimous relationship with one's realities and self or discomfort, we must, right, know what mind is, know how mind states manifest, which they manifest out of that upbringing, right, out of the emotional processing. And most importantly, we must understand and see our own mind states and the process of our mind in a balanced or equanimous fashion. And then if somebody is, a mindfulness-based addiction trauma therapist, we often tell them that you can't be one unless you are practicing cultivating an equanimous relationship with your own mind. You can't teach mindfulness really unless you are practicing it in some way, shape, or form yourself. And I should preface, I don't mean mindfulness as in like you have to sit on a zafu, with a meditation bowl. You can do that if you want to. That's perfectly fine. I like to do that sometimes. But mindfulness can be practiced, when you're sitting, walking, standing, eating, or lying. So lying down, right? So you can incorporate mindfulness very practically into your life in anything that you're doing. And this is I think, the most powerful way to use mindfulness. Because if not, our mind creates these constructs that, oh, I can only practice mindfulness when. And that's not true. We can always practice mindfulness in any moment, right now. Okay, so now that we have a good conceptualization, hopefully a foundational conceptualization of mind, let's move briefly into the neuroplasticity of mind. And I just love this graph, which is from Richie Davison and Daniel Goleman's book. Um, and it shows the current rate of studying mindfulness in relationship to uh, treatment and brain plasticity. And you can see here, for the longest time, it took a long time to catch on. I really started to become mindful back here when, and started practicing it here when it was kind of looked at as that kind of hippie thing, right? And that kind of, oh, you're out there in left field. But now we can see exponentially the research has grown. And the reason it has grown, and the reason we're incorporating mindfulness into schools now, into prisons, into all of these aspects, into executive training programs, and into addiction and trauma treatment, is because the research at this point is totally overwhelming. I mean, it is just very clear that this approach is very, very powerful and can work incredibly well in the treatment of addiction, and as well as trauma and other categories. And so this is looking at some studies that were done with neuroplasticity. And as we know, neuroplasticity is the brain's physical adaptability to environmental stimuli. It means it grows and prunes, right? Dendrites and neuronal connections in relationship to environmental stimuli. And what we see here is we see two neurons here, one in a control group and one in a chronically stressed group in the hippocampus. And as we know, hippocampus, right? I always used to tell my students when I taught psychology that the hippo went to campus to learn, right? So the hippocampus helps us create memories, and it's also very important in regulatory processes, and it helps us regulate the activation levels in response to emotional distress. And what we see here is that we can see in a control group here that the non-chronically stressed subjects have highly dendritically connected axons and neurons. So dendrites are the branches that come off. You can see this long branch here, which is the axon. And then here you can see dendrites approaching off of it. And those dendrites are richly connected. Well, the brain doesn't provide a lot of real estate to something that it doesn't hold in high regard, right? You use it or you lose it with the body. And so what this tells us is that the hippocampus is really used in this control group. However, when it's chronically stressed, right, those dendrites begin to prune and it begins to disappear. And this is a more sparsely connected hippocampus or neuron. And so what this tells us, what we infer from this in the studies, is that a person who has chronically stressed, who comes out of a chronically stressed environment, will be more highly reactive to lower levels of stimuli, right? And so this shows how neuroplasticity affects the brain in a kind of destructive way, if you will. Forgive me if you hear my dog. Um, he obviously is barking a little. So, and so this is very important, because if it happens in a kind of what I would term as destructive way, then we can capture that and do the opposite with it. And so dendrites, right, dendrites are neuronal connections in the brain. And the amygdala, right, which is emotion, helps control or mitigate emotional responses to fear and arousal. And lo and behold, we see the same thing, but in reverse order here. Control group, an amygdala that's not highly dendritically connected. And then in a chronically stressed group, we see a highly connected amygdala. So not only is a person more aroused, their ability to, not only is their ability to decrease their arousal decreased in a chronically stressed group, but their arousal process, their intensity, their trauma reaction, right, is more readily uh, accessible, right, will happen, it will be more likely to happen. And we see this all the time in our clients who have experienced trauma. And I love what Dr. Gab Mate says, right, which is that not every person who's traumatized will become an addict, but every addict has been traumatized. And that's one of the premises that we make as mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapists, is that addiction is nothing more than a normal reaction to abnormal causes and conditions, or to trauma. So this was another study done that looks at reversing that process of neuroplasticity to harness a decreased reactionary process. And Vipassana meditation, which is a certain type of meditation that's compassion awareness focused, and how it's affected on recovery rates related to trauma, and, or I should say, related to arousal in people who have PTSD and ADHD. And what they had seen here, and this is also presented from the Mind and Life conference, is we see here that those people who were not meditators had a much higher arousal and a longer recovery period, right? In other words, it took them longer to recover from the intensity, to calm their nervous system. And we can see here that the people who practiced this for 8 weeks, right, they had a much more pronounced ability to regulate their reactivity, to decrease that trauma response. And so this is one of many studies that have been done. Here's another study, right, that shows the amygdala, and you can see here the levels of reactivity before, or the hours of lifetime practice, right, which is lower here, right? And so the levels of reactivity versus those after increased practice, right? And you can see that there's a much lower rate of reactivity. And this was a study done in 2018, so it's a little bit more familiar. This is a study that I love. It is related to smoking. And you can see here MBAT interventions, right, or mindfulness-based addiction therapy, right? And we can see here cognitive behavioral therapy. And you can see that the recovery process was more pronounced than CBT in those who practice mindfulness-based addiction therapy recovery processes, right? And so, and the difference here, I should say, right, between, and it might seem like a small difference, but it actually comes out to be huge. The difference between just CBT and mindfulness-based CBT is a couple things. One, most of the most pronounced things is that we don't, in mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapy, we don't look at thoughts as distorted or broken. We really see those as just a survival, natural, normal kind of process that the mind does to relate to the environment, that it's a normal outcome to the abnormal causes and conditions. That's not to say that mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapy doesn't incorporate a lot of CBT skills, because it does, but it just takes it one step further. And it also looks at mind states and mind stories, and evaluates things from an emotional standpoint. It looks at things as if emotions, the bias of mindfulness-based addiction trauma therapy is that emotions are the drivers underneath everything, all the other mental constructs. And if you think about it, that's the way that the brain developed, right? The limbic system developed first, then kind of the reflex centers, then this prefrontal cortex. So it would make sense that that's the way we cognate. But that's not to say, I'm in no way saying that cognitive behavioral therapy isn't incredibly powerful and a wonderful tool, because it is. And I would never knock it. So now I want to talk about this idea of isomorphism. This is a big word. And one definition of this word is that it's a one-to-one structural correspondence with two or more different entities in their constituent parts. What does that mean? I'll explain in a second, right? It's the concept in Gestalt psychology that there's a structural correspondence between perceptual experience and neural activity in the brain, right? That they're interrelated, that it doesn't happen in isolation, that everything happens in relationship to everything else, right? So there are no compartments. You know, when we're working with addicts, they come into our room and they really believe that there's compartments, right? But more than likely, the proof that there's not compartments is the fact that they're in the space, or that they're in getting treatment for recovery. And because that's proof, right, that they were detached from reality. And so this is kind of the argument for isomorphism. Everything that we do, even right now, as I'm speaking with you and you're viewing, we are changing each other's nervous systems. The words that you're hearing from me are constructing and turning on epigenetics, off epigenetics. You know, all of this process is happening. And there's nothing that happens in isolation. And so this is a very important concept, because if we take that to in the understanding of that, if we take that into treatment or into the world, then whatever we're experiencing in the moment impacts what's happening in our space or in relationship to other people. And if we don't have an attuned awareness of that, then we can't account for it. And if we can't account for it, then as a clinician, that concerns me. We will always want to do our best, right, to account for and have awareness of our own internal states, because they ripple out like waves in the ocean, right? So this brings up the concept of self, and this is kind of the closing portion of our discussion. And as I said before, right, we are not our minds, and most people believe and identify that or what most people believe is themselves is really just their mind, right? It's not really them. They are the observers of their mind. And we can see this because in those moments that we have awareness and we're able to choose a different choice, that's proof that we're not our mind. If we were our mind, there would be no choice. We would just identify and go, right? So the self is the observer, is the seer of mind, right? Is the person that observes the mind, or the awareness that observes the mind. And so this is where we're going to get it's going to be a little bit difficult, but the self is not a specific thing, right? And that goes back to that plane of possibility, which brings up here, which is the Ford plane of possibility, which I bring up when I'm training other therapists. And what we want to look at and think about is that, and for many reasons that are founded in different sciences, physics, and other things, we're going to go with the idea here that reality is just an open plane of possibility. I could make many arguments for that, but that's not for this talk. So if reality is an open plane of potentiality, then what the mind does, right, is it starts to interpret that potentiality through the frame of emotions. And that constructs, those emotions then trigger the development of mind states. And those mind states create stories in our mind. And those stories manifest behaviors. And when we have a traumatized mind, because it's in a trauma reaction, right? When you're in a trauma reaction, you're not going to, if you're in a crisis situation, you're not going to take a lot of time to ponder and think. If a tiger's coming at you and it's going to attack you, you're going to react. This is the traumatized mind, right? And what happens is for a mind that's been traumatized is even though the environment may have changed for that person, the mind is still reacting to reality as if it's in that past. And our process as therapists, right, is to invite the person into allowing themselves to experience the distress, which is done in many different ways, in a safe manner so that they can exercise the distress tolerance long enough to start to have a more open and spacious awareness of what choices and actions they want to take, right? And we do this by helping them identify mind stories, mind states, which then we give them a vocabulary, a vernacular for their emotionality, and then teach them constructively compassionate interventions to care for themselves in relationship to the distress so that they then can have a more open way of relating to the world and relating to reality. And I put this over here because this would be like, the marathon meditator, right? Those people who, have meditated for years and hours, and right, they're the Olympics people, right? So this is really like this. If we had a mind that had this much awareness in it, we would be doing really well, right? Um, Generally, this is a ideal goal here, but obviously we never really get there 100%. But we can definitely change how we do that, right? And so, one way that we can recognize that that process is not happening is that the person lacks self intimacy. And the way that we can notice that is if they have that harsh kind of self talk, right? Or they have a harsh relationship to mind states and mind stories, then they're not going to trust themselves. They're going to be divorced from those things. They're going to right push away from let me rephrase that. They're going to identify with those things and push away from the discomfort of the emotions. But the byproduct of that actively doing that, right, is that they're not going to trust, they're not going to have intimacy with themselves. So they're not going to trust themselves. And we see this a lot when we do inner child work, right? And the person, you know, that child kind of runs amok in the person's life and there's no adult to show up, and that's because that emotional part of themselves lacks so much trust that they can't sit in the discomfort, right, to invite trust back into their lives, right? And then that creates avoidant behaviors. An example of this in trauma might be, let's say, um, a, a person is betrayed, and so they develop this harsh self-talk with themselves, right? They're, how could I not have realized, how could I have not have known, now I don't trust myself, oh my gosh, and then they'll start to do behaviors that seek safety or seek a way to try and avoid the discomfort of the reality that they're in, which is that it's a very painful reality. They were betrayed. They have every right to be hurt and angry and terrified and all of those. But when we participate in these avoidant behaviors, then we lack intimacy with ourselves, which then creates more self-talk, lack of trust, and avoidant behaviors. And it becomes that feedback loop that we so often hear about. And so in order to counteract this, and by the way, right, as this is happening, neuroplasticity is happening. So the more we participate in this process, the more likely it is, the more strengthened that the neural pathways become, right, in relationship to this process, and then the more likely it is that the process will continue. And so in order to counter this, we have what I term as the Ford isomorphic path to intimacy. And it starts with first awakening to our emotionality. And this is really at Mindful Centers, the first step that we take with our clients, right? Is helping them create an awareness and a vernacular and a way to describe the emotions, right? Then we, that would be the second one, right? Being able to identify and describe them, where they are in their body, things like that, right? And then invite awareness to those mind states and mind stories, and then practice mindfulness to to improve distress tolerance, which then moves into the practice of constructive compassion. And the idea of constructive compassion, I'll explain it this way very briefly, right? Destructive compassion. An addict says, is shaking and says, I need a beer. You hand him a beer. You've alleviated his suffering or her suffering in the short run, but in the long run, you've facilitated their demise. That would be destructive compassion. Constructive compassion. You don't give them a beer, but you invite them to a treatment center. In the short run, they'll be very angry and they'll be frustrated and say, I just want a beer. But if they go to treatment and they get the help, you've helped them rescue themselves. That's constructive compassion. And so we can only learn to practice constructive compassion when we've improved mindfulness and distress tolerance enough to be able to sit in the presence of our discomfort to then formulate a focus in our mind, right? That helps us relate constructively to the world. And if we're a mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapist, we can prescribe constructively compassionate interventions for clients to practice. And then this will help us relate to ourselves in a non-reactive manner. So instead of being aversive, having an aversive mind state to the emotional discomfort, we'll invite that in. For me, as a trauma survivor, sexual abuse survivor, I was raped twice, I was molested throughout my childhood. I get the wash of shame intensely sometimes. And I used to really push that away viscerally. And I've really worked hard to be able to invite that in and take that in and just breathe it in, allow myself to experience that in my nervous system, and then constructively focus my mind on the fact that I love myself and that I'm safe and that it's okay. And that, I will have that internal talk of, I'll call myself little Darrin, and I'll say, you're okay, little Darrin, you're safe. Big Darrin's here. And sure, people might think I'm crazy, but I just tell them that my therapist gave me permission to talk to myself if they catch me talking to myself. And all of this, right, all of these building blocks builds a road to an equanimous relationship to self. This will then allow us to be able to be more present in our own emotional discomfort. And that is isomorphic. It allows us then to become better able to be present with the discomfort of those we love and care about who might be experiencing emotional discomfort. And so in closing here, I love this quote. It's from my book, Awakening from the Sexually Addicted Mind, A Guide to Compassionate Recovery. And it says, feelings are not a sign of brokenness. They are a sign of our humanity. They are not to be avoided, but embraced, normalized, validated, appreciated, and loved. And that is kind of my mantra that I try to follow in my life and in my work. And I have found that it's been incredibly powerful for me and for many clients. So in this, we defined what mind is, right? In mindfulness, we examined neuroplasticity in mindfulness. We explored the role of mindfulness in neuroplasticity in treating addictive disorders. And we identified how self and self-intimacy is vital to the recovery process. So what I'll do now, we have a few minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my share and we can look at some of the questions in the Q&A. Any suggestion for those who have had huge recovery in one area, say sex addiction, but cannot get a handle on another addiction, say food, binge eating? How can they find recovery in both? Any thoughts? This is a beautiful question. And this is a vitally important question. So what we do when we train people in MBAT therapy, or when we help people with addiction recovery, is we look at 8 domains of recovery. And in those 8 domains, you have relationship to self and others, relationship to physical activity, relationship to food, relationship to focus, relationship to sleep, relationship to sex, relationship to work, and relationship to money, I believe. And so we want to focus on all 8 domains. And what happens is if one of those 8 domains isn't really looked at and a mindfulness relationship isn't invited into that area, then the person will get recovery in one area, but it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole, right? There'll be another, the addictive pattern will start to show itself in another area. And so what we want to try to do is treat all of those areas. So what my recommendation would be is to possibly, if you have good recovery through the use related to sex addiction, but you have trouble um, with food or another area, would be to maybe start to work with a mindfulness-based addiction and trauma therapist, or work with a mindfulness-based recovery coach in correlation with your primary therapist. And that can also bring on the ability to do that. So, that would invite that process in, but it's about creating a balanced relationship in all 8 domains of recovery. So again, I just want to say thank you so much. I know there was one other question, and unfortunately we didn't get to it. But I just, thank you all so much for your time, for the gift of your focus, and be gentle with yourselves. Take good care, and hopefully I'll see you all soon. Don't hesitate to email me if you have any other questions. Darrin, Darrin, @mindfulcenters with an S.com.